today, as part of our ordination ceremony, it's interesting. Normally we plan out our messages about a year in advance, but we are continuing on in our sermon series in the book of Matthew because it ties precisely in with what we're going to talk about today. So I want to encourage you guys, if you have a Bible with you, or if you want to grab one from the seat in front of you, feel free to grab it and open it up to Matthew chapter 27. We're going to read the first part of Matthew chapter 27. If you don't have a Bible with you, like I said, there's one in the seat. There'll be verses up on the screen. If you're using the Pew Bible like I am from the seat in front of you, you're going to be on page 997. So feel free to thumb open to that. Now, I briefly wanted to share an observation with you guys as we go through this. This weekend, I had a chance to go take my daughter with me to a board meeting for Little River Christian Camp and Grove Christian Camp, which are the camps that our church is connected with. And it was a nice time to just get to spend some time with her while I was doing some ministry stuff. And it's funny because on the way back, Hazel, my 6-year-old, said, "Daddy, I don't know what I'm going to be someday." You know, and that's a big question at that age, isn't it? The sky is the limit at 6 years old in terms of what you can be. And as parents, you just never know. Here I have 5 kids, age 6 and under, and I couldn't tell you exactly where any of them are going to end up. I hope they end up following God. I hope they end up faithful to Him. I pray for that. But only time will tell. And yet, as we get older, sometimes even at age 25, we don't know exactly where life's going to lead, do we? We're still figuring that out. In fact, sometimes even at age 45, we're still figuring it out. But God has a plan for all of us. He has an intended use for all of our lives. And for many of us, one of the challenges is not only believing in God enough to ask Him what it is, but believing He's strong enough to accomplish something beyond what we might imagine. And today, as we go through our message, you're going to see 3 different lives that are highlighted here. And in those 3 lives, what I want to point out to you is all 3 of these lives are going to end unexpectedly in death, and yet only one of them is going to end in glory. Only one of them is going to end with somebody going and being seated with God above and entering God's kingdom. And there's a distinction in how decisions are made that result in each one. So we're really going to have a character study of sorts. Now, as just a reminder, we're in chapter 27. There's only 28 chapters in the book of Matthew. We are entering the last day of Jesus' life prior to His death, burial, and resurrection. And Jesus, in the previous section we saw, was put on trial by several of the religious leaders, and they had captured Him after He was betrayed by Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples. They ended up charging Him with blasphemy, started beating Him ruthlessly on the spot. But from here, they now have to make the transition because the Jewish people at this time and the Jewish leadership, including the chief priest, didn't have the authority to execute anybody, and they desperately want Jesus killed. They now have to transition from them saying He's guilty of blasphemy to somehow convincing Pontius Pilate, who is the governor of Rome, of this area of Rome in Judea, to execute Jesus and to take His life. And all of this is happening during the Passover, which is a lot like Christmas time in the Jewish calendar. It's the most sacred religious holiday, one of the ones nearest to everybody's heart. And I want to remind you as we go into this, in terms of Passover itself, Passover was a specific day where they celebrated God's deliverance of the people of Israel from Egypt. But then after that was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which extended the day of Passover out a week. And so frequently we'll hear in this passage them talking about the festival. And normally in loose Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic of the day, what God's people are talking about is that whole section of time, the whole ceremony, including the Passover feast, but then also the subsequent days of unleavened bread that follow it. And that puts us right in the middle of this holiday. Just as a reminder with that too, it's actually unlawful for the Pharisees to have arrested Jesus during this time. It's unlawful for them to have tried Him during this time. The trial happened sometime around midnight, where they actually got Him together. They weren't allowed to do it after hours in the dark. They weren't allowed to do it during a holiday. They've thrown all that out the window, and they did it intentionally because they were worried that people would riot and would do something to stop them from killing Jesus. But now they've somehow got to complete this thing without themselves getting their hands dirty and being judged guilty of murdering Jesus themselves. And so they need Pilate's help. Hopefully that gives us some context. We're going to break our passage today down into 6 different parts. We're going to read each one and discuss it. We're only reading through verse 31, but there's a lot going on here. So this is going to be one of those days where it'll be really rich in the word of the Lord and lean on the word of the Lloyd. But I hope as we discuss this that it'll come to life for you, and you'll begin to see how God is moving in this. And we're even going to bring in some interesting historical notes that I think will paint a fuller picture, because if you guys are like me, you weren't alive 2,000 years ago. And so some of this might be a little bit unfamiliar. Let's begin with verses 1 through 5. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and elders of the people made their plans to have Jesus executed. They bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. All right. Now, as a reminder, Judas Iscariot was with Jesus through all 3 years of his ministry. He was called by Jesus. He was invited by Jesus into the kingdom. He had a role to play there. And yet, throughout his life, we see the other disciples frequently commenting in the gospel about how Judas was playing the role, but he was actually pretty crooked. He was going out and he was stealing money from the treasury and using it for his own purposes. And it wasn't like Jesus had an immense amount of money coming in, but the money that they used to live off of, he was constantly robbing them, and he was the bookkeeper for them at the same time. And so he could move a few zeros around and shuffle things around and make it look okay. And we have a suspicion that part of why Jesus ends up betraying Judas is because he knows, I'm going to get caught soon and this game's going to be up. And I don't want him to find out and know what I've done. And so I can go get cash out here, betray Jesus. And in his betrayal, he allows the Pharisees to come in the middle of the night where no one's around, in a private area in the Garden of Gethsemane, and arrest Jesus and drag him off from there. And we hear that morning that the Sanhedrin got together. And in fact, John's gospel expands this out and says there's a similar dialogue to the one that happened the night before. But they asked Jesus if he's the Messiah, if he's the Son of the living God, which he says, yes, I am. Now, that would be blasphemy if it wasn't true. But Jesus is uniquely qualified among all people in history to say it and have it be true. Not only does he fulfill all 350 prophecies about the Messiah in the Old Testament, but on top of that, he's done miracle after miracle. This guy has raised people from the dead. He's stopped natural disasters. He's cured disease. He's cast out demons. What more could you do to prove that you're God incarnate than all of those things? It's a pretty exhaustive list. But the Pharisees don't care. They've come together, they hear him say that he's the Christ, and they say, well, then you're claiming to be a God when you're not, and we're going to have you killed. Now, what is going to happen is that Matthew will come back in a minute to what happens after that trial. We hear that Jesus is brought to Pontius Pilate, and we'll pick up at that detail after this next section that we just read is finished. But afterwards, he fills in the story and tells us that at the same time frame as this, Judas comes back. Probably Judas has heard the verdict. I bet he's been looming around trying to figure out, hoping maybe Jesus will just get a whooping and be let go. But he soon starts to realize they're not stopping with a beating. These guys are going to kill him. And Judas begins to feel guilty. Now notice Judas doesn't repent. He doesn't rush up and say, you know what, it should be my head rather than his. I betrayed this completely innocent guy, and I was part of him being in this position. But he does feel guilty at least. There's not that full repentance, but there's guilt. And he comes into the temple, into the same place where he made his dirty deal with the Pharisees to betray Jesus. And he says, I betrayed an innocent man. You can have your money back. Basically, let him go. This is my fault. Notice the callousness of the Pharisees, though. They say, that's a you problem, not a me problem, dude. Well, actually, he is guilty, Judas. He really did do something. There's no argument like that. They know he's innocent, but they say, you know, that's a problem for you, but we don't care. And so Judas takes this bag of coins, not wanting it near him, knowing this is blood money, that I took an innocent person and I sold their life for this, and he chucks it into the temple. Now, historians, we don't know from the Gospels, but historians argue, did he throw it into the holy place in the temple, or did he throw it into the temple treasury? Where exactly did the money go? And we'll hear there's a few more details coming up here about this, but whatever the case, he tosses the money, and then he goes off, and he hangs himself. Now, I will say a lot of scholars, particularly liberal scholars who have some doubts about the Bible, will look at the book of Acts and notice that in the book of Acts, when this event is referenced, they say that Judas fell and that his guts spilled out on the rocks. And so you hear two different accounts of how Judas died. And I want to point out to you guys, the reason that the book of Acts doesn't say Matthew got it wrong and it's this other way, because it was written after Matthew's gospel and they would have had a copy of Matthew's gospel, is because if you knew the area where he killed himself, here in the valley of Gehenna, just outside of Jerusalem, it's a giant dump area, then you'd see that both things are really possible. This is not an area with great, big, prodigious trees all over. It's mostly brush. But there is about a 30-foot cliff face right outside in this area. And if you wanted to kill yourself by hanging in that time, this is one of your few good options that you could find. The trick is, because it's smaller brush, it's almost like sagebrush, it would be very easy to have you hanging yourself turn into the brush breaks loose, the knot on the rope slips free, and below you in that valley is nothing but jagged rocks. So we don't know the exact time frame. Maybe it was a couple days later. Maybe it was in the very act. But somewhere along here, the likely story, which makes absolute sense, is Judas went out there, tried to hang himself, and at some point, either the knot slipped loose or the shrub broke loose, and he fell down and then very graphically broke open on the rocks. But again, there's a logical explanation for that, how this happens. Judas ends his life, and he is so wrought with agony, and his priorities have been so misplaced that ultimately he ends up dying here before Jesus even does. And it's a sad waste of a human life. All right, so let's go ahead then and pick back up and finish this section. If I can turn my page here. We're now going to finish with verses 6 through 10. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It's against the law to put this into the treasury, since it's blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. Now, this is an intriguing turn in events here. In the same area where this suicide happened, there's a crop of ground that's pretty useless called the potter's field. And we see it referenced as that clear back in the writings of Jeremiah and Zechariah. Now, the Pharisees, for their part, they're in a tough spot. They have this money, and it's very intriguing how the moral standards of the Pharisees work. It might remind you of some people you've met even in the modern time. They're not really worried about the fact that they're about to murder an innocent guy. That's not such a big deal. But they are worried about taking blood money paid to illicitly arrest this guy, and putting it in the treasury. That would be a big problem, and we don't want to do that. And so they're trying to figure out, what do? We don't want God angry at us because we put the money in the wrong box, and he'd be upset because we did pay this money to have Jesus murdered, basically. So how do we work around that? And their solution is, rather than put it in the treasury, let's just take it, we'll go buy this field, and if there's any foreigners that travel through our land that are not devout Jews, then we'll just bury them, and that'll be the pauper cemetery, the place where the poor and the outcasted people can go, and they can be buried. Judas is already there, so it's a shortcut. Let's just send the other people there too. Interestingly, outside of the Bible, we see this referenced, and even Matthew says that's why it's called to this day, the field of blood. So even 20 years later, as Matthew is writing his gospel, people still know this place. His audience, who is largely Jewish, would say, "Oh yeah, that place, I know exactly where that's at." Many of them might have even heard from their parents the story of how that all transpired and what happened. But Judas's blood money is used, it buys this place, and they feel like this lets them wash their hands of it. Okay, well, at least, we murdered an innocent guy, but at least we didn't have to deal with putting our money in the wrong box. That would have been really upsetting. God might not have been happy with us. Sort of an interesting moral standard here, isn't it? You might be starting to get the sense that they're less focused on God. I want to point out with this too, we're about to start reading some things that don't look especially good for the Jewish leadership. And just a word of warning as we talk through this. Some people will use this passage as an excuse for anti-Semitism. All the early Christians were Jewish people, without fail. The church grew in Judaism. There are plenty of good people in Judaism. It's an unacceptable use of a passage like this when we talk about the betrayal that Jesus found. It's unacceptable to use that to look at a racial group and say they're all bad people. That's never been the intended use of the Bible in this case. Really, what we're getting at here is that in Jewish society, much like our own, most of the people at the top are pretty corrupt. They're focused on the wrong things. And that's something that we can take home. But all of this is happening, and it's not outside of God's knowledge. God has ordained every one of these things. Everything that's happening here is fulfilling prophecies. I also want to mention, with that reference to the book of Jeremiah, there are events in the book of Jeremiah that are being referenced, but the actual quotation comes from the book of Zechariah. The big point here is in Jeremiah's passage, we see that Jeremiah is ordered to take a clay jar out to the potter's field and to break it there. And he's doing it symbolically to warn the Israelites, you guys have left God, you guys have betrayed God, and because of that, God's going to send the Babylonians in and they're going to wreck you just like this jar got wrecked. Be ready for it. And in the same way, God's people, the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, they're ignoring God. They're not paying attention to him. And guess what? God's going to take them out of that position. God's even going to destroy the whole temple before he's through. There's a vivid warning in that same sense. And there's also this prophetic note where this field's going to be bought and used in this similar way as sort of a death warrant a few times over. Your position's going to be gone, and you might think you're airtight in your authority, but you're not. All right, now verses 11 through 14. Meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they're bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Now, there is a pretty unique history around Pontius Pilate, and it's important to understand the precarious position he's in to fully understand this account. Pilate had actually come into power as the governor of this area. He was an up-and-coming political actor, and he had taken authority as the governor of Judea right around the same time that Jesus' ministry had started, so about 3 years ago. And Pilate, there were big hopes for his political future, and yet, when in his first year in Jerusalem, he caused a lot of waves because Pilate resented the Jewish people, he hated them, and he thought what they were doing was nonsense in terms of worship. And one of his first acts was to go into the temple and bring dozens of shields that had the face of Caesar put on them and hang them up all over the temple. He decorated the whole place with it. Now, Caesar revered himself as a god, and so this would basically be like coming into the church and putting up a bunch of pictures of pagan gods and pretending like that was okay. To say that the Jewish people were not happy about that event is a gross understatement. They became furious. The Jewish leaders actually came to Pilate and they said, to him, demanded from him, "You need to take down those shields. We need those things gone right now. This will not stand." And Pilate said basically, "Get lost or I'll kill you." How's that sound? And as the governor of this area, the highest judicial and military authority in this area, it was in Pilate's rights. He could have crucified every one of those guys if he'd wanted to. Interestingly, those religious leaders, many of them the same leaders, this is only 2 years before. What they did is they laid down on the ground, pulled their cloaks away, and said, "Get out your sword and do it then." They were that fanatical about making sure that pagan shields did not end up inside the temple. And ultimately, Pilate, realizing if I kill every Jewish leader, they're probably not going to be happy about it. I'm probably going to have a war on my hands. That was his number one goal, was to avoid civil unrest in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was a place that had many occasions of civil unrest around this time frame. They never really liked being under Roman rule. So in that case, interestingly, they risked their lives just to stop the temple from being desecrated. And yet, here we are now, years later, and they're not in that position. Now, the political tension between Pilate and the Jewish people continued to increase. He hated them, but he put up with them. He said nothing good to their faces. For the Jewish people's part, they, especially the political leadership, they were kind to his face, but they spread all kinds of rumors behind his back. And one of those was that they sent delegates, it's recorded outside of the Bible, they sent delegates to Rome to say to the emperor, this Pontius Pilate guy you sent out here, Caesar, you better watch out, because he's coming for you. He wants your throne. He wants to undermine you. And this is the last thing that Pilate would want heard. But we hear from Josephus, the historian, that spies from the Emperor Tiberius have started to actually infiltrate Pilate's household, his cabinet, his area of political power, and they're watching him, keeping a close eye to see, well, will you cross the line? Will you actually do it? That puts him in a very precarious position as Jesus comes before him. Now, the Pharisees come and they go up just to the outside of the Tower of Antonia, where Pilate lives when he's in Jerusalem. Normally, he's in Caesarea, which is the capital city of the area. But because of the Passover and because of the high risk of things going sideways, he and about 200 of his soldiers are garrisoned here, and they're going to try to make sure no civil rest comes up. And so about 6 in the morning, we estimate, Jesus is brought to him. They interestingly bring him and they stay outside of his house, because if any of these religious leaders went inside his house, it's all but guaranteed they would get close to something that was ceremonially unclean, and they couldn't continue celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So they wait outside, they bring Jesus to Pilate, and they say, this guy needs to be killed. They raise several accusations we read in the other Gospels. They say that he claims that he's a king, that he is causing people to riot, and that he is saying that nobody should pay taxes to Caesar. Now, a bunch of these things are just patently wrong. I mean, Jesus does claim to be a king, but of a heavenly kingdom. Just 2 days before in the temple, he said, pay to Caesar what's Caesar and God what's God's. He never said you can't pay taxes. And there's never been a riot that Jesus caused. And they would have noticed had he done so. People would have seen this. So Pilate starts to see through what's going on. And yet, here is this guy brought before him. Now, Pilate finds out in the course of conversation, we see in John's gospel, that Jesus is actually from the northern area of Galilee. And as a result, he figures out, well, then I'll send him to Herod and see if Herod will get rid of him. Matthew's gospel skips over this detail. He's just summarizing things a bit more. But he was brought before Herod. Herod is amused by Jesus. He wants Jesus to do magic tricks for him. When Jesus fails to do that and doesn't defend himself verbally, just as he didn't before Herod, he's not doing this not because there isn't a defense, but because he knows none of these people are going to listen to me anyway, and this is what my purpose in life is anyway. Herod has him beaten and then puts a robe over his back, one of his own private royal robes that are in normally a purple or a reddish color that kings would wear, and sends Jesus back to Pilate. Now, all that happens in this same section, even though we didn't just read it, but it's some interesting history to fill in there. But you can see things are progressing here. Jesus is in a rough place. An appeal to Herod Antipas does nothing. We do read, actually, that Herod Antipas and Pilate begin a friendship because of this interaction, strangely. But from Pilate's perspective, he doesn't see a good reason to actually charge Jesus for anything. So let's continue on now with verses 15 through 18. Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus, who's called the Messiah? For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. I want to point out that last verse. You notice here, he's seen through it for Pilate's part, and this is important to what he does next. Pilate knows the real issue here has nothing to do with Jesus actually being an upstart who's trying to overthrow the Roman emperor. That's the kind of charge that he would have to take seriously, but he sees no evidence of that. In fact, he sees through the situation with accuracy and says, these guys are just jealous of him, and they want me to murder him because they don't like him, but I don't have a really good reason to do that. There's nothing that's compelling here. And so at this time, there is normally a option that has been offered by Pilate, where he will allow a group of Jewish people who are locals to come together, and they can choose one prisoner who's on death row who can then be set free. And he did this to gain favor with the Jewish people, hoping that they would, not riot and like him more and accept his authority. And so at the same time that the chief priests are trying to convince him to kill Jesus, Pilate sees a way out. He says to himself, all right, this guy's innocent. I know he didn't do it. Even Herod doesn't see anything that this guy's done wrong that justifies killing him. I'll give them this option. And so we have this guy named Barabbas. You see here, some texts don't actually have the word Jesus Barabbas, but it's probably something he added to his name. The word Jesus means God delivers or God saves. Barabbas, we find in the Gospels, was an insurgent who went off He murdered Jewish people who were faithful to the Roman government and stole money from them. And he also went and attacked Roman soldiers and killed them at every opportunity he could. He was hoping to stir the nation of Israel to go and throw off the chains of Rome and take over their territory and take it back. So he was a military leader of sorts, going out and doing this. Interestingly, that makes him somewhat popular with a lot of the Jewish people. A lot of them feel like this is exactly what we need to do. And so Pilate gives this choice. You guys here, you have Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus Barabbas. Which one do you guys want to set free? And I think in Pilate's mind, he's hoping the innocent guy. Why don't we set the innocent guy free, given the choice here? And yet the crowd gets lobbied by the Pharisees, and they start saying, no, let Barabbas go. We want the murderer. We want that guy set free. He'd be a better one for us to kill. Kill Jesus. Get rid of him. This is putting Pilate in a tougher and tougher place. In the other Gospels we see, there's a moment here where Pilate will actually take Jesus, send him out, lash him, and then bring him back to the crowds, hoping that will placate them. But it makes no progress with them. That lashing, briefly to describe it, you guys have perhaps heard me say it before, but this is one of the most intense punishments, and we'll see it happens again here in a couple minutes, that can happen to a person. It's a standard part of the crucifixion process. And what happens is that a whip with a wooden handle and leather tassels coming off of it is taken. And each of those little strands of leather has either a piece of glass or bone or metal that's put into it. It can even be bone fragments, and it's woven into the end of it. The person's shirt's taken off, their hands are chained to a post, and they are repeatedly whipped with this thing until the meat of their back is torn loose. 60%, it's estimated by historians, 60% of people who were crucified died from the lashing before they even got to the cross. It was a commonplace thing, noted by historians, that after a man had had his back lashed, often you could see through, and the meat was torn away enough, you could actually see through to his intestines. This is a gory, graphic thing, and Jesus isn't doing it for no reason. He's doing it for us. That makes it all that much more significant. His robe is put back on him. In the other Gospels, we actually hear they leave it on a while, and then they tear the robe off. You can imagine if you had bloody wounds that had scabbed up. This is not a fun exercise. Pilate's hope is, maybe if I brutalize this guy, and if I just beat the tar out of him, they'll say, you know what, that's good enough. I don't think we're going to hear from that guy again. But that's not the position they're in. They want him dead. And so they cheer for that. Verses 19 through 26. Let's continue on with that. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask Barabbas and to have Jesus, and to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Which of the two do you want me to release? Asked the governor. Barabbas, they answered. But what shall I do then with Jesus, who's called the Messiah? Pilate asked. They answered, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Then Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but instead an uproar was starting. He took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I'm innocent of this man's blood, he said. It's your responsibility. All the people answered, his blood on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas to them, but Jesus he flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now we'll hear more of those executioner details here in a minute. But you can see as things continue forward, Pilate's wife actually sends a servant out to get a hold of him. And she does this because she's had an extremely vivid dream the night before. Interestingly, in the pagan culture of the day and in Jewish culture, it was broadly understood that oftentimes God might supernaturally speak, or the gods, in the case of the pagans, might speak to you through a very vivid dream. And so the idea that his wife felt tortured the night before, had this terrible dream about this exact guy, Jesus, who, by the way, she hadn't met. He wasn't there yet. He wasn't even in their presence. She had this vision of him, and now she looks out and she sees he's here. That's the same guy. And she knows from her dream he's completely innocent. nothing has happened here. This wouldn't have just been a weird coincidence for Pilate. This would have been as if God himself had said to Pilate, don't do it. Now, again, in the other Gospels, we get another detail here. The crowd actually says that Jesus calls himself the Son of a God. And that makes Pilate nervous too. So he brings Jesus back inside, and John's Gospel records a conversation that they have. Pilate is asking Jesus, what is the deal here? What is these crimes that they're charging you with? Answer me. And Jesus still remains silent. This is an attribute of one of the prophecies about the Messiah, incidentally, that he'll be quiet when he's under trial, that he won't be speaking out constantly. And finally, Pilate insists and says to him, don't you know that I hold your life in my hands? You live and die based on what I decide. And Jesus says to Pilate, you have no authority that wasn't given to you from the one above you. Now that can have a couple meanings. For Jesus, what he's clearly talking about is, hey, Pilate, God let you be in this place, and you will be accountable to God someday for what you do with the place you're in. So you better do with it what God wants. And would God want you to kill an innocent man? No. But even if not that, if Pilate merely understood it to mean Caesar is above you, you serve Caesar Tiberius, and so you should do what Caesar Tiberius wants. Would Caesar Tiberius actually want to have an innocent man killed? Well, maybe he would in his own personal interactions, but as a principle, I'm sure if you asked Tiberius, he'd say, yeah, don't kill innocent people. We wouldn't want to do that. So either way, he's accountable to a higher power, and his decision needs to be made based on that, just as we need to make our decisions in our lives based on that. We don't just do what's convenient or what other people tell us to do. We need to make our decisions based on what God says is the right way to handle things. And not even this pagan leader is going to say, hey, just kill innocent people. It's no big deal. He would have a problem with that. Pilate should take that as a warning, and yet he doesn't. He walks back out with Jesus, and the people continue to cheer. Kill this guy. Get rid of him. They even begin to threaten, we see in Luke's gospel, and say, you know, if you're actually Caesar's friend, Pilate, then I would think you'd want to get rid of an insurrectionist. If you're really serious about this being governor thing, maybe you'd want to take care of that. And that was very clearly a veiled threat. If you don't do what we say, we are going to go get into Caesar's court, and we're going to tell him there was an insurrectionist, a guy who wanted to overthrow the government by the name of Jesus Christ, and Pilate did nothing to stop him because Pilate likes people who are trying to overthrow the government. He wants you to lose power. That's what's going on here. Despite the warnings, despite Jesus' warning, despite his wife's warning, he goes on. He takes Barabbas, sets this murderer free, and he takes Jesus and sends him off to be flogged, to be beaten, and to be crucified. Let's finish out the passage now, verses 27 through 31, and we'll tie this together. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail the King of the Jews, they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. And after they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. So we read, these men yet again changed his clothes. The whole group of 200 or so soldiers, they gather around and they're going to have a fun time. This is their entertainment for the night. They don't care about this whole Passover thing, but we have an opportunity to kill one of these Jewish guys, and that sure sounds like fun, so that's what we'll do. They lashed Jesus again. We understand from the passage, probably he got lashed on both sides. He was lashed on his back, inverted, and then lashed on his front, so where the same damage was done. They put a robe on him. They took a large crown of thorns and spun it together. As you guys have probably seen in pictures, those thorns in the Middle East get pretty long. And so we're talking about a 2-inch spike stabbing into his head. They scrape it down over his head. And then here he is on his knees. They give him a reed to hold as if it's his scepter, and they mockingly bow before him. Hail the King of the Jews. Aren't you something special? And they take clubs and they whack him in the head, hitting those thorns and trying to drive them into gray matter. Again and again, Jesus is spit on. He's mocked. He's beaten. Everybody gets their turn. and we haven't even got him on the cross yet. This is not an easy way for Jesus to go. Now, obviously with this passage, we can't miss the fact that Jesus didn't do this for no reason. He did it for us. He had a higher calling, and to pay the price for your sins and for my sins required a hefty fee. Jesus gave exactly that. And the Bible tells us really clearly that if you accept that sacrifice, and that if you take him not only as your Savior, but as your Lord, which means he's in charge of your life, he gets to make the decisions going on in your life, that God will deliver you from death to life, that he'll give you a new heart, and he'll begin to transform you. That's the gospel, and if you haven't accepted Jesus today, I want to encourage you, make that step. This is exactly why we need to. We'll see as this book rounds out, it's not the end of what happens to Jesus. It's not the end of his life. He lived beyond that, and he lives today. But for Judas's part, and for Pilate's part, these are very interesting endings. Judas has an opportunity like all of us might have dreamed of, put on a platter before him. God incarnate on earth invites him to come along for the journey. For 3 years, he gets to see, he gets to hear, he gets to watch everything that Jesus is doing. Every miracle he has a front row seat to, every supernatural thing that happens, every teaching that occurs, he can absorb. He is in the midst of all of this, and he has the potential to be one of the most substantial religious leaders of his day and to start this movement that'll change the face not only of Judaism, not only of Christianity, but of humanity as a whole. But for 30 pieces of silver, the cost of a slave, he throws it away. He chooses money over God. That's the important thing to him. And because of that, he dies. And he doesn't join God in heaven. He goes to that other place. For Pilate's part, the readers of this story would have known his end. Pilate will be 2 more years ruling in Jerusalem. There'll be civil unrest that happens, and in the midst of that, the governor of Syria will accuse Pilate yet again, probably for political reasons, of actually being in cahoots with people who wanted to overthrow the Roman government. Pilate will be called in. He'll stand before Tiberius Caesar, and Tiberius will decide, you are guilty. I'm done with you. Pilate and his wife will both be taken, and they'll be exiled, not a penny in their pocket. Walk to the border, to the nation of Gaul, modern-day Turkey, and they'll be exiled there, basically given the promise, we ever see your face here again, it'll be the last day of your life. You can stay out there in poverty. And according to historians recording the remainder of his life, they say Pilate actually within a year commits suicide. He has the same end that Judas has. Pilate knew what the right thing to do was. He knew that this was an innocent guy, and he, as a political leader, had no business murdering some innocent guy, even if people were going to throw a fit about it, even if people were going to act out of line, and others might get hurt. It still doesn't matter. You don't go around and just kill innocent people out of convenience. But Pilate's so worried about what everybody thinks that even though now he has an opportunity to understand the gospel, to meet God himself in person, Pilate sees none of that. God's right before him, but Pilate's not going to follow him. And Pilate's not going to follow him because he decided he would live his life for lesser things. And this is the crazy part of the whole story. There are 3 men who are going to end up dead at the end of this passage, but only one of them is going to go on to glory. And the strange part is, these people are facing similar decisions to what we face today. You guys, every day in your lives, you're going to have to answer questions about what do I live for? How do I answer these questions? You're going to have moments where it's very convenient to go and hurt somebody around you, to go and accept a lie that the world offers, and you're going to have to decide in that moment, where do I fall with this? Do I do what God says because I follow him first? Or do I do what's convenient? Do I chase money or wealth or power or influence? Or the opposite sex? Or what do I fill my heart with? What do I make my life about? And there's only one answer in all of that that leads to Jesus, and that's following God first. Today, as we gather here for this ordination, what I want to point out to you guys is the intention of this time is for somebody, in this case Josh, to take his life and to say, whatever happens from here forward, I want to put God in the middle of it. This is not a life that's going to lead him to be super wealthy. He's not going to be the most politically important person on planet Earth. He probably could be more successful doing other things, but he's choosing this out of obedience to God because God's called him to do it. And that's something we can celebrate. I have to tell you guys, as a pastor, it disheartens me sometimes to see that oftentimes in the church, we talk about going into ministry like it's a death sentence. Like it's a terrible thing. And I remember my father even, maybe I shouldn't say this, my father even said once to me, he said, you can do whatever you want, Lloyd, whatever you do. He was a career school teacher. Don't be a teacher and don't be a preacher. Great advice. Well, I only avoided one of those things, but you know, often in our society, there's that feeling that this is a bad thing to do, and it's not easy. It's not easy. Neither of those things are easy, incidentally, but it's not an easy thing to do, and yet many of us are called. And maybe you're not called to vocational ministry, but I can guarantee you that whatever it is you're doing right now, God calls you to do that for his kingdom. You can be a teacher who represents Jesus Christ. You can be an accountant who represents Jesus Christ. You can be a lawyer, a sanitation worker, a police officer, a nurse, all of those things. You guys have probably encountered people in a variety of occupations over your life who stood out because they stood up for Jesus, who stood out because they loved you even though it was of no real benefit to them, and they were showing God's love to you through that. Those are the kind of lives we're called to live. And today, as we call Josh and Ari up here in a moment, I want to emphasize to you guys, be praying in your own heart for what God has called you to in your life, but also let's take a real focus here in a moment to pray for Josh, because I can guarantee you that by doing this today, he and Aria are drawing a target on their back from the devil. When somebody says, I want to go out and spread the gospel, there are a few things that make the devil angrier than that. And so we as a church need to support them through prayer, and that's one of the things we're going to do as they have this ministry commission today.